Peter, démosle un gran aplauso a nuestro amigo Peter Gloor.
Muchas gracias, Cristobal, for the invitation, and thanks a lot for giving me the chance to talk to you in the next 45 minutes about creativity. What I would like to do is, I'm trying to make this thorny issue of creativity, because with creativity it seems to be like with pornography, you cannot really describe it, but you know it when you see it. And we are trying to measure it through the lens of social network analysis. And what I would like to do in the next 45 minutes is first give you a brief introduction of how I define creativity. And for me, creativity never is something in isolation, but it's something that you have to do together. I can be super creative, but if you don't know what I'm doing, it's gone as soon as I'm not there anymore. And so, how do groups of people interact when they are creative? So that's first quick overview, and I will present to you the concept of the coins of the collaborative innovation networks that I have been studying for a very long time. I stumbled on them by chance when I still was at Deloitte, as Cristobal said, because as a consultant, you know, your job is to be billable. And whenever you do a project, the main objective of the project is to recruit the next project. And what I found at Deloitte is that in the evenings, we had so much more fun. And we did much better projects on the side. And some, we were not paid for doing those. And that's, we also invented some new ideas, which of course for consultants it's just hot buzzwords and a lot of slides, and somehow I never got rid of that habit, so you will see some hot buzzwords and fancy slides also in my presentation. But it got me started on studying those creative forms. And I would like to give you two examples. First, inside the organization, where we mostly do that through email analysis. So I will show you two examples where we looked how medical researchers became more creative, and also looking, and that's not so much about creativity, but about measuring and predicting how happy customers will be with a company based on the email network of the account executives. And then I will look for creativity in the outside world, and I have studied Occupy Wall Street, that sort of super chaos, creative chaos. Here I will give you a somewhat more boring, but more measurable example of predicting elections. Because the beauty of that is, when you look at social media and you try to do predictive analytics, which is what we are doing, you always have the hard problem of making things measurable. And if you go after something like the stock market, for example, that is very measurable, but people will lie. They will say, I have this super secret tip about this great company, but the only thing they really want is that you buy their shares. And so you have to read between the lines, and we do that also through content analysis, which was spoken about today before, but this is very hard. And you have to try to tease out what we call the honest signals. Things that we say without meaning them really, but they are close to what we really want to say. And there are very simple honest signals, like looking into people's eyes. There are other honest signals. We were recently working with a bank, and we noticed that the more the bank tried to talk about trust, the less the customers trust the bank. So, same thing with hope. We looked at tweets and the language used in tweets, and we looked at fear, worry, and hope, and we found that the three of them are very strongly correlated. That means you only speak about hope when you have lost hope. So that's another of those honest signals, and we are trying to mix those based on content analysis And in this example, we are just doing the obvious thing in the US, which is predicting the elections. That's very measurable. We have all those great polls that lots of organizations are doing, and that means we always can benchmark our social media analytics. So that's one example. And the other example is Wikipedia, because for me, Wikipedia is the greatest self-organizing swarm encountered that one can think of. And we have studied it a lot, and I will show you some very nice examples of the sort of things about the national soul you can read out of Wikipedia. It's quite amazing. Now, let me start with a quick introduction into the collaborative innovation network concept. And I would like to just share with you an episode of my own life 20 years ago, when I was a young postdoc at MIT, and I had published a paper about hypertext. And then I met the already mentioned Tim Berners-Lee. That's the person that you see here. And the way how that happened, it was really, at that time nobody knew who Tim is. I was accepted as a presenter of a paper about hypertext in San Antonio. I was dragging my computer, which was much bigger at that time than the nice Mac that I had, to demo my system there. And then Tim came. Only nobody knew who he was at that time. And he told me that his paper had been turned down at the conference, which embarrassed me slightly because I was a member of the program committee at that time. As an aspiring academic, that's the sort of thing that you have to do to build your reputation. And also to build your reputation, I thought that something like the World Wide Web would never ever succeed. But because I'm from Switzerland, Tim was working at a Swiss organization at that time, at CERN. When he asked whether he could put up a pile of slides about his system, besides my computer, I was very happy to say yes. And Tim also was very enthusiastic during the entire conference. He organized a birds of a feather session during lunch because he couldn't present his system in an official track like I'm having the privilege right now. And he was able to recruit a small group of other people, not me. I had better things to do at that time, I thought. And they were other postdocs and graduate students. And they worked with him to convert his creative idea, his vision, into a running system, into a product. And for me, this is the second step of strong creativity. You have the truly creative individual. The individual recruits a small group of people. It embraces them as equals. They work very hard for normally a few years. In the case of Tim Berners-Lee, he's still hard at work after 20 years. So stubbornness is certainly one of those criteria. And in the case of the web, my boss at that time, David Clark, head of the Internet Engineering Task Force, I happen to be a postdoc in the Advanced Networking Architecture group. He was much smarter than me because he realized that he was actually up to something. So he invited him to come to MIT, but Tim did not get a desk at that time, an office. He only had a small desk in the hallway and a very old and clunky computer, but he didn't really care. He only cared about his idea, and so he was communicating by email at that time, so that already existed. And he used the web to launch the web, and he would really reflect his thinking every morning, and just on the web, telling, today I spoke with Peter, I looked at the CyberMap system, it's a nice thing, I might try it out. So he was communicating all the time. And over time, he was able to recruit some more people, and they formed the World Wide Web Consortium. He also got some companies to sponsor his activities, and after 2 years, it became obvious even to me that the web might actually be a good idea. And so when he organized the first conference in Geneva at CERN, I wanted to go there too, only I could not, because then it was too late. The whole thing was taking off, and the conference was heavily oversubscribed, and so I was left out. But then there were others, like Mark Andreessen, who took Tim's idea, created the first browser, Mosaic, which became Netscape, and so this thing was unstoppable. And for me, finding disruptive innovation means finding those creative swarms. And the reason why I call them swarms is that, like the bees, which are my favorite thing to study, they have a goal and a direction, and they even do good to themselves and to the rest. And that's also why I very much like Wikipedia, Linux, and so on. They all have the same characteristics, but it turns out even commercial companies like Google, Facebook, and so on, you have some very driven founders in the beginning. And if you look at the business models of those companies, it's a lot about sharing. Well, they get very rich for themselves, but they give away 99% of their product. And it works beautifully for everybody. So what I would like to talk about now is how can we find those creative swarms through social network analysis, and how can we measure their creative output. So this is something which I call knowledge flow optimization, and it basically means that we have communication archives, and these days it's either blog links, Twitter, or the web at large, or Wikipedia. If it's inside the organization, it is email, and we also study interpersonal interaction on the small team level, and then we have something which we call the sociometric badges, and they look a little bit like this remote control. We put them around the necks of people, and then it measures honestness. It measures whether we look into each other's eyes, how long we look into each other's eyes, whether I'm excited, my energy goes up and down, and whether my voice is getting bored or it's really exciting because I think it's cool. And it also measures whether I let you speak or not. It turns out that's a great predictor. If I'm always talking, forget about creative groups. The more you get turn-taking, that means that you let each other speak, the higher the collective intelligence of a group. That was one of the results that we did in a project, not led by me, but by my boss, Tom Malone. And he was looking at collective intelligence, and he found that the willingness for turn-taking was the first criteria of collective intelligence in those small groups. It was groups of people just doing IQ tests. And what we also found is that if you have a bunch of super smart people and you get them into a group, it doesn't really help. You can get, now I hope I don't have too many McKinsey consultants, which I offend, 5 super smart McKinsey consultants, you put them into a team and you get nothing out of it. But there is 3 things. The willingness for turn-taking. The second thing is emotional intelligence. If you can look at each other's eyes and figure what people think, and we used the test, I think it was called Many Eyes or something like that, and you just see the eyes of the other person, and then you have to guess whether they are sad, happy, angry, mad, and so on. If you are good at that test, and you have lots of people with that capability in a team, the team will be collectively more intelligent. Now, I am very bad in that test, but it turns out I'm in good company. Half of mankind is very bad in that test. Men are not so good in emotional intelligence. I guess, actually I was particularly bad. I guess I'm too much of a geek, and as I'm frequently told, geeks are slightly autistic, so I guess I have to live with that characteristic. But if we have more women in the team, the collective intelligence goes up. So those are the three criteria on the small team level if you want to make your team collectively more intelligent. So we have those interaction patterns, and then we construct the social networks, and we look for the coins. And coins, it's just my word for, in the social network language, a clique, which means a fully connected subgroup, or almost fully connected. And if we have those little groups, then we can zoom in on them, and if we look at Twitter, we can construct retweet networks. In Twitter, we actually also tried follower networks, but we found that they didn't work so well because it's just too big. And I was really impressed by one of the presenters who had millions of Twitterers, I think, because doing that with graph theory is really hard, because it's computationally extremely expensive, and to the third if you want to do all of those fancy algorithms. And what we found, if we look at retweet network, who is being retweeted, that is a good way to measure individual influence of people. So we take Twitter networks, we take Wikipedia networks. I will come to how we measure Wikipedia networks, because we also found a particular spin there which works better. You can just take the link networks, how our page is being linked, and in the end I will show you some very nice Wikipedia maps that will show who the most important people for each culture are. But when you construct Wikipedia networks based on co-authorship, meaning two self-motivated swarm members, two Wikipedians edited on the same page, then the pages must have something to do with each other. And this is another, of course, honest thing. It's not obvious. Wikipedia doesn't show it to you. But if you aggregate that on the large level, you get amazing things. So we take those networks, and in the end, we don't play Angry Birds, but we look at the satisfaction and the performance and whatever metric we have to compare with our networking structure. So that's the basic recipe, and now I would like to share my 4 examples. The first one is about a project we have been working on for 3 years at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. This is one of the biggest children's hospitals in the US. It has about 50,000 employees. And we are working to replicate Tim Berners-Lee, so to speak, at the hospital. Meaning, we want to create coins, collaborative innovation networks between patients of chronic diseases, and we started with a disease which is called inflammatory bowel disease, or Crohn's disease, or ulcerative colitis. And normally, the percentage of people in a population that have that disease depends on the level of civilization, because the theory goes, if you grow up with a lot of dirt, you will not get Crohn's disease. It's one of those autoimmune diseases that you get if you are brought up, like in the US or in Western Europe, too clean. Now, I was just asking a few people here, and it seems in Chile some people know that disease also, which means you might already be too civilized. When I talk about this in China or India or Africa, nobody ever knows what I'm talking about. So we are in the process of creating those coins. Coins between the patients of the chronic disease, and this is a really bad disease, Crohn's disease, because there is no cure to it. You either have to take very strong drugs that depress your immune system, or you get an artificial exit for your intestines, for your bowel movements. It's really not a nice disease. And you can only cope with it, there is no cure. so far. So we have patients, caregivers, that's spouses and parents, because normally this disease breaks out when kids are about 10 to 15. And then we have the researchers and the doctors. And I was really extremely impressed when Peter Gloor, the mastermind behind that project, sort of the Tim Berners-Lee of that project, invited me a few years to do this, because as a medicine professor, he was sort of a demigod. And you know, in academia, there's strong pecking orders, and now I make slightly nasty comments about doctors. In medicine, it seems to be particularly strong, but here they have this idea of embracing patients as equals. They have a patient advisory council, which advises them how to proceed, and in particular, we would like to create creative sub-teams, that's viewpoints, so to speak, which are always composed of patients, doctors, caregivers, and researchers to come up with new cures and ways of improving the lives of those patients. And by now, in IBD it works extremely well. We have already started branching out to liver transplants, to cystic fibrosis, to diabetes, the autoimmune type kind of diabetes. So it's now already the same framework being applied to other types of diseases. And we started for once not in Boston. Normally all many smart things come either out of Stanford or Boston, but in this case it was in the middle, somewhere Cincinnati. One wouldn't have expected it, but now it's already being adopted. So the process is the same. We have those coins, and we are trying to grow them. And what I'm showing you here is the process of how we help those creative teams to grow. I call it virtual mirror, which means we measure the social network structure by getting the email archive, and then we compare that with some performance metrics which will tell us which networking structure is the best, and then we mirror that back to each team, and then they will know how close they are with respect to the ideal networking structure. Let me show you how this works. So in this case, we started with getting the mailboxes of 8 people in the core team, and just through these 8 people we got like 20,000 or 30,000 email addresses, or you could call them participants in this crowd building experiment. And the red dots in the center, those are the core team members, and each of those different typed color blobs at the outside, that's the mailbox of somebody else. Each dot is a person. Each connecting line is if you have exchanged email, and the more email you exchange, the shorter the line gets. And you see in the beginning, everybody has still other lines. That's those big blobs outside of the red dot in the center, which means those are the people that are common in those different mailboxes. And those obviously are the members of the, we call that C3N, Collaborative Care Network. That's the coin here. And then we see the next steps, and we see how Peter Gloor and some of his colleagues have started the project. They are the centralized leaders, and then they apply one of the insights that we have found in earlier network analysis. If you want innovation, you need to rotate leadership, and this is something which, by just looking at the venous centrality of people over time, which is one of the things that the Condor tool can give you, you can get very easily. You can team members which are have the academic qualification to work in the team, but which are also Crohn's patients. So we get real, I call that bees. Be a bee. You want to have members of the beehive. and that worked extremely well. Then in the next step they do, again inspired from the bees, I call that the waggle dance, which is advertise what they are up to. Very simple insight, do good and tell others about it. If you just do good, if you want to grow it, particularly in the case of the coin, you need to tell others. And the bees, when they have the honey source, they do the waggle dance. And in the case of email, it just means sending out many emails. But it's something which is very measurable. And then, in the end, you get what you see here, which is you actually do more to spread what the bees, for bees is called attraction pheromone. So you perfume the environment to tell this is something which is really hot and attractive. But you already can see how new coins are born. And those are 16 new projects that have come out of the original coin and that we are now working on to improve the lives. And those are simple things like guide sheets for the patients so that they can more easily adhere to the complex drug regimen they have to follow. But we also have, for example, applied sociometric badges to patients to predict when they get what is called the next flare. And that was another one of those ideas. So some very crazy ideas came out of that community. And in the meantime, we are still doing virtual mirroring, and what you see here is a team over time, which when we started, it was really split into three. And it takes courage for the leader to accept such a picture. But in this case, she did. And you can see the other picture is a few months later, how they got to really integrate the team. So in that sense, it works. We also do sentiment analysis, and in this case, what we found is that if you speak in positive terms to each other, that's certainly good. If you speak in negative terms, that's not so good. But if you speak in honest terms, which means you have positive and negative aspects, it's much better to be blunt. And this is also quite a cultural thing. Americans are not blunt. Chinese are even less so, but Finnish and Dutch, they say everything. And in the beginning I had a hard time to get used to the Finnish habit, but once you get used to it, it makes life really easy because you know where you are. But here we were able to show that. And so, just to illustrate the point, this is my own mailbox. And yeah, I'm a big hoarder of email. And yesterday in the class I tried to download my mailbox and it blew my computer. It's about 100,000 messages or so. But it also illustrates another one of my favorite points. Don't be a star, be a galaxy. Be embedded into groups of other people. And you can really see one of those clouds, the center point, that's obviously me. You might expect, so I'm probably still too much of a star. I should try to delegate even more. But you can see one of them is the classes I'm teaching, and another one is the Cincinnati Children's Project. Sometimes they really have a tendency to take over my life. Those coins, they are very demanding. Once you have given in, it's hard to resist. And the other thing you see is betweenness curves over time. And for example, the green line, that's our new administrative assistant at CCI. And you can see how he's, for some time, taking over my life, which perhaps it's a good thing, because I told the same thing to Cincinnati, that they need to delegate stuff to others. But very easily, it shows you who is for you the most important people at any given point. And the nice thing here, it's not steady, but it's oscillating. And that's how it should be. You want to have fluctuations, so that's what we were looking for. And here you see the 16 or so projects of Cincinnati Children's, which our dependent variable was measuring the outcome, how successful the teams are, ranked by peers and ranked by team leaders. And peers, of course, are more honest, but you need to get, the problem in our case is not that we wouldn't be willing to expose ourselves, but you need to get them to look at your prototype and to give you a ranking. So we measure that over time, and here are the results that we found. So you want to have central leaders. That's really the point. When I started this project 10 years ago, being Swiss and coming from one of those democracies where we try to have everybody equal, I thought it's good to have no leaders and have a very delegated structure. But now, after having studied Wikipedia and those creative projects where you have team learners, lead the language forwards, and so on, you need central leaders, even here. But they need to have a very good leadership style. So in this case, if the network is too dense, which means too many people are exchanging emails, that doesn't even seem to be good in that context for creativity. But what you want is high numbers, many people involved, but just a little bit, and central structure. So you want to have a core of people which is very clearly recognizable. And we also looked at language, and we measured how focused we are, and it seems if we are focused, it's actually good. And this is really only applicable to this project because we have studied a lot of those open source teams, and sometimes it's much better if you are open in early phases and you collect a lot of diverse opinions. In this case, because we are already sort of a pre-selected coin or coin of coins, you need to be focused again. And so those are the sort of things that you can tell to your team members. Here, just sort of the same point again with some statistics. I would now like to switch to a second project where we measured satisfaction of customers with big outsourcing services provided by a global outsourcing company, an Indian outsourcing company with 40,000 employees. And they measure satisfaction of customers with something called NPS, Net Promoter Score, which is very primitive. Basically, you just ask your customer, how likely are you to recommend me to your friend? And if you say, I will highly recommend you, you are a promoter. That's why it's called Net Promoter. And if you say, I will never recommend you, you are a detractor. And obviously, you only want promoters. Now, the beauty was that when we looked at the email archives of the account executives of the outsourcing company, that predicted with very high probability for the next 3 to 6 months the Net Promoter Score. And the story was again the same. You need central leaders. If you had a few people in the core, and normally it's better not to have one, but a few of them, and they are very steady. So here, in the other one, we wanted oscillating creativity. Keeping outsourcing customers happy is not so much creativity, and so here we wanted a more steady structure. So if it was steady, but very clear core periphery, then it would predict satisfaction. And also in this case, we have another metric which we call contribution index. We measure how much people send and receive email. And the less that deviates, the more steady the pattern is, happy the customer. He always wants to get about the same rate of new emails. The point is, we also look at sentiment, and sentiment predicts, but communication structure is much better. So this is one of those honest techniques. Just look at email structure and you will know how happy your customers are. And here are basically some of the correlations. So just so you see they are not so bad. This worked actually quite well. Now, I'm noticing time already progressed quite a bit, but I would still like to share a little bit of the outside cool hunting, so 2 inside examples, now 2 outside examples. Just one from politics, namely US election prediction, and another one, Wikipedia. So what we basically do, we take blogs and Twitter, because those are, and also Wikipedia, 3 main sources of that mirror opinion of society. Blogs are good because blog posts, they are sort of the expert. If you look at Huffington Post, I'm just talking about the American online newspapers right now, they reflect what journalists think and say. So now, and this is another point, how much can you trust experts? Because experts are like consultants. They have a hidden agenda, they want to sell their own services. So you have to read their honest signals between the lines. Twitter is the crowd, but the crowd has its own problems. It's very fickle and it flips very well, and I also like to say the wisdom of the crowd very easily becomes the madness of the crowd. And you never know. E-business bubble burst or Tea Party Occupy Wall Street fight, you always see those sort of things where reflecting the public opinion in Twitter, it changes very quickly. Just looking, for example, in the EC about whether Greece should leave the euro. For quite some time now in Twitter, the Germans have been saying Greece should be kicked out. It's very clear there. But the experts, Angela Merkel, the blogs, and Wikipedia so far have kept Greece in the, and obviously the reality also. Sometimes I forget the reality by just studying all those virtual networks, which is a general societal problem in my view. There is no reality anymore. There is only reality by virtue of Google, Bing, Yahoo, Wikipedia, and so on. And whoever controls that, and that's why I like Wikipedia so much. Because out of all of those sources, it's the only one which is open and transparent. Google, Bing, and Yahoo, there is Larry Page who controls how we serve up the search results. Which is actually why I'm right now trying to convince the European Union that we should do an open web index project, where we get sort of a competing index to Google, which is open and accessible for everybody. But nevertheless, Google is so far doing a pretty decent job of trying, and it seems more or less convincing, in their ranking order, because if you are worried on the result 5,633, you will never be found. So they can really put you in hell and you are lost. But if you look at those political networks, they seem to mirror reality pretty well. So here is Mitt Romney against Barack Obama on the blogs. And as you see, Wikipedia has a huge influence on the politicians, which is also why they spend a lot of time polishing their Wikipedia pages and also linking them. Here is another example where somewhat earlier in the campaign there was Rick Santorum fighting against Mitt Romney, and Rick Santorum, the web couldn't really stand him, but on the blogs he was the leader. But we also looked at emotionality, which again is just how positive and how negative at the same time people were, and they were very emotional about Rick Santorum. The point is we never just count searches. We always multiply what people say, meaning, let's say, Christopher says 10 times Mitt Romney is great. Then I will look at his social network, and I will take his between centrality, and if Cristobal is really central, I will multiply the 10 by his between centrality. And we do that for Twitter, where we take the retweet networks, we do that for blogs, and then it's just how quickly and how widely are my blogs linked, and we measure influence. And if we do that, we did that, for example, for the South Carolina elections, most of the time it works. So it's statistically significant positive, but it's not as good, honestly, as if you just do polls for people. So, because sometimes you get good outliers. So here are some pictures. This here is the betweenness curves over time on Twitter. And that will tell you what the Justin Biebers and Lady Gagas, that's number one and number two on the Twitter sphere, by far the most influential Twitterers. If they say something about Barack Obama, his betweenness mentality will boost, jump up. Because those tweets will be retweeted like crazy. And so we can take here very discrete measurements of how popular people are on Twitter. And of course the US presidents are perfect, because the elections, that's the hugest possible sample we can have, which becomes really fine-grained. As soon as we zoom in, it gets much harder. There are tricks, but it doesn't get as significant anymore. And then we can look at things like this Wikipedia network. I think here, play. No. I don't know. No, that's too fast. This is new. So what you see here is a short period in the fight between Romney and Gingrich at that time through their Wikipedia pages. And what we do, we just, whenever a page which links back to either the Romney or the Gingrich page is being edited, then we add that to the map. And what that gives you is a historical, like a past history of what people have been doing over time in the context of the elections. Now, you have to somehow filter the information, because if you wouldn't filter it, you would get thousands of pages. And that's a little bit of black box magic, but it's transparent black box magic because we describe how we do it. But overall, it's a really new way, only thanks to Wikipedia, to any topic in history. So that's this example, and I think that's automatically. The other point about Wikipedia, which I was already mentioning, and I call those networks who works with who on Wikipedia, or not W3 but W5. And this allows us to discover hidden links between topics, just because large groups of people have been working together over extended periods of time. And this here basically explains how we construct the networks. We start with some network, and then we do snowball sampling and we combine them. And just to conclude, I would like to share some pictures that came out of this. First, snapshots of the English Wikipedia over actually 7 years of time, which will show you also what Wikipedians thought would be important. So initially, they were very much into musicians, into boxers and politicians in 2003. Then you see here the Wikipedia grows, and this is just the Wikipedia people pages linked to each other based on those co-editor links. And then you see how they finally Barack Obama becomes more important, because George W. Bush before was the most central one. You also can see what sort of musicians they like, and over time it does more and more reflect our full real world. But only from the Western perspective. And the beauty of Wikipedia, we have it in hundreds of languages. The English Wikipedia, of course, is by far the largest. but it's totally the westernized American-centric perspective. And that's why we also took other language Wikipedias. So in the Japanese Wikipedia, you get something which is called AV idols, which is very central. And I'm told those are porn stars. If you look at the Korean Wikipedia, you'll see what sort of sports they like. The Chinese Wikipedia is heavily censored, and so it's not so relevant. That's also probably why they don't like the politician pages so much. Then we have the German Wikipedia, where the Pope is surprisingly central, but that's because the Pope is German right now. I guess that's the reason. And there might also be some debate about his Nazi past. That would fit the Wikipedians. And then we have the Spanish Wikipedia, and the most important politician there is Michelle Bachelet, which I found totally surprising because Mexico is like 8 times bigger than Chile, but it tells me that Chileans must be active Wikipedians. It could also be that Michelle Bachelet is a hero of all Spanish-speaking people, but somehow I don't believe that. She's a very nice lady, but that somehow seems to be interpreted a little bit too much. Then we looked at the French Wikipedia, which looks very different. And just for fun, I did one last project in Wikipedia where I measured the percentage of active Wikipedians together with corruption index. And it turns out the higher the percentage of active Wikipedians being defined as doing at least one edit per month. So the more of those you have, the better for your country. The less corrupt you are, and there is another correlation to the credit default swap between corruption and credit default swap. And so in that sense, all of us should be members of the swarm and active Wikipedians. Thank you very much.